Hello. Sorry about the little hole we lived in here. It's nice to have a crowd. I'm Ed West, and I've been working down here as a volunteer historian for like a little over 10 years now. I think that some of y'all have been to some of these lectures before, and some of you haven't, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to say a moment about the museum and what we're doing down here. We've been developing details of Summerville history, actively developing this for some time now. I got interested in it when I first moved here well, actually I'd been before I moved here in 1975 when I came back to Charleston after my sojourn in education. And I began to hear people from Summerville in my medical practice saying that Summerville was a healthy place. And I didn't know why they would say that. I'm a doctor, and I didn't know why they would say it was any more healthy than it was Greek. And so I would ask them why they said that, and they would say, well, it's something about pine trees. And that's all they knew about it. I mean, I said, what is it about the pine trees that makes it healthy? Look at me, I'm healthy. and so I got interested in this, I guess, the science, and what they were saying. I said, well, I just want to know where it came from. And so I started doing original research at the medical college, well, the MUSC library now, the archival library, on why would you say Summerville was healthy? It turned out there's a whole bunch of literature on Summerville being a healthy place. And it comes from before the 1880s when the inns started going up, to a time of colonial times when people were aware that up here, and it was, the elevation here is 70 to 90 feet above Charleston, which was getting up in the Rockies. I don't know if you've ever been up the top of Mount Pleasant or not, but it's just not that high. And certainly Summerville's higher than that. And then they talked about it being cooler up here, and it's hard to believe that too. That's what they said. They said it was cooler up here, and it was they had more breeze up here and stuff like that. And this was all related to what they called the miasma, which was the odor of the air, basically, that they thought made you sick. And if you've been around Pluff Mud, you know what they're talking about. And they had what they, and from the very start, they had what was called country fever, which today would be called malaria. And they were aware that you didn't get country fever if you came up to Summerville before the middle of May, and didn't spend the night somewhere else until after the first frost. And so this is how this settlers of this area, this is how they started getting interested in coming up here. That story goes on, and that possibly is another topic for another day, but I want you to know this was the beginning of how they were figuring out this was a place to live, and that's what we're talking about today, is who the people were that came up here and actually settled here. The story actually begins, I guess, with the settlement of Charlestown. The proprietors, the Lord's proprietor of Carolina, were commissioned by King Charles II to make money. There were other reasons to settle other colonies in America, but this Carolina colony was basically a financial venture that they were trying to make money from. And the Lord's proprietor came here pretty focused on how you make money around here. They started growing all kinds of stuff, and they started looking for stuff to see what they could make money from and things like that. One of the first things they found was just beyond the coastal part of Charlestown. They started running into pine trees, and it turns out that there's like a necklace of longleaf pine that grows down basically from Virginia down into Texas around the southeastern corner of the United States, goes down into Florida. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey might be part of it too. Pine Barrens of New Jersey is a place. And the pines were growing about 20 miles inland and going in up to 100 miles inland as a really big woods. The pines of that time were not what we see around here, and I've actually never seen a true primordial longleaf pine, but they're described as being at the range of, I don't know, 8 to 12 feet in diameter. It's hard to think of a tree with that big a trunk. And I mean, that would be from where I am to the wall. That's the base of the trunk, is how big it was. And it went up, straight up. You haven't seen one of those around here. They're regrowing these trees now, and you can see them every now and then around in places in Summerville where they're planted saplings, and they're little almost bush-looking things that 500 years from now perhaps will be what they're talking about. But these trees were filled this whole area where we live now. The nature of the ecology of the pine forests is that there are periodic fires, as you might see in California every year. The American Indians who lived here would deliberately set fires to gather game. They would set a fire in an arc, and they would be in the center of where the arc would come together and wait for all the critters to come out of the woods, getting away from the fire, and then that's how they would hunt. And so fires would be set both naturally and by the Native Americans. And the woodlands would burn, but the pine trees didn't burn. And this is because longleaf pine are naturally fire resistant, and even the little seedlings are fire resistant. And so I lived in the Philippines at a point in my life, and I was in the Philippines at the end of the dry season. You could actually hear the bamboo exploding in the jungle, and the exploding bamboo would set fires out there. I guess that all of a sudden there'd be a big fire going on in the jungle. We lived up on a ridge, and I could watch the fires from where I lived, but they didn't get up. Sometimes they got up to the backyard, but they didn't get up to where we lived. And what I noticed was, as soon as the rainy season started, 2 weeks after, the whole place was just black down below where we lived. The whole place was black down there after one of these fires. And 2 weeks into the rainy season, it was all green again. And it just came back. It just came back. And the jungle would be back there and looking as usual, and green everywhere. Within a matter of weeks, in the rainy season, the jungle would be back. And it worked that way around here, that what would grow around here would be the equivalent of prairie grass. If you've been to Charlestown Landing, you've seen that they have, it's either a buffalo or a bison. I don't know what the difference is personally, but I think there's some kind of difference. But anyway, you know what a buffalo looks like. You've seen one out at Charlestown Landing. They lived here. They were here when these guys got here, the buffalo. It's kind of hard to think about it, but that's what it was like. And so what we had here were these huge pine trees in prairie grass. And right here at Summerville, what we had was bluffs. And the bluffs here are remarkable for the area. When you drive around Summerville, you get the impression that you're going up and down hills. But what you're actually doing is you're on a plane and going down to a ravine and then coming up out of the ravine again. The ravines are cut through this area from the northwest to the southeast down to the drainage through Azalea Park into Sawmill Branch. And if you just think about it, I mean, you think about where the low areas are. Laurel Street, for instance, is actually a branch of the Sawmill Branch. Laurel Street drains into Azalea Park. There's a branch right beside St. Paul's Church that drains into Azalea Park. All these branches aim that way towards Azalea Park. And then the drainage out of Azalea Park, of course, is out to the Earl Farms Parkway today. When these people first came up here, that whole area was swamp. And at the area of the Presbyterian Church, the Summerville Presbyterian Church, was where Pike Hole was. was 30 feet deep. That's pretty deep water. And it's called pike hole because that's what it had in it. The pikes are fairly large fish. It's hard to find fish that big around here. But that's what was here when they got here. And we're talking now about the Woodlands time. So the people that settled at Charlestown got to make a buck. One of the things they figured out was, well, maybe they could make a buck growing rice and indigo and things like that. And of course, that's a pretty famous part of Charleston history. To do that, though, they needed the wash of the tidal water going back and forth to control the flow of water across the rice lands. Of course, they didn't want to have salt water doing it, and so they had to get above the saltwater area for the flow of water. Well, that's where we are. We're above the flow of salt water. The Ashley River is tidal just south of here, and it stops being tidal somewhere around Bacon's Bridge. And but the tides controls the flow south of us, east of us toward Charleston. Up here they had the Sawmill branch with this huge amount of water in it, coming through these ravines and all this, going down the Sawmill branch, which gave them a whole nother water supply of flowing water, and it was flowing. The first settlers here heard the water at night flowing through the town, which is, it's just hard to think about. There was that much water coming through here. So they weren't thinking of this place particularly as a place to live, but they were thinking of it, how can we make a buck up here? One of the first people that come up here was people representing Lord Ashley Cooper, who's famous for two rivers, but I don't think he was ever here. But he, on the other hand, was kind of directing people to do stuff and make money. And so he's the people representing Lord Ashley Cooper, who own a whole lot of land where we are right now, set up a trading post just south of what's called Cook's Crossroads. Cook's Crossroads is the junction of Highway 61, the Plantation Highway, Ashley River Road, and Highway 165, which is the Delamar Highway, coming up from Highway 17 south going to Savannah. That junction down there is at the Caw Swamp. There's currently a major county park there, which is really worth seeing. It's a good way to understand how the culture here developed from that culture, because that's where a whole lot of the first people who came up here came from, was down that area around Caw. Came up Highway 165 to this area. Highway 61 is probably about the oldest sanctioned road in South Carolina. Before 1700, the planters that were building rice fields like Middleton and the Drapers and all along the Ashley side, were told by the Colonial Assembly to build Highway 61 using the labor on their plantations. And so that highway started showing up before 1700, going west from Charlestown to the area of what's called Crossroads. And that Highway 165, Delamar Highway, coming up from south of Charleston at Cook's Crossroads, and then continued up into what the area is called Beach Hill. Beach Hill is across the Ashley on 61, going all the way out toward the ponds. So that's how the roads developed around this area, just to kind of get a feeling of it. As they were building the rice fields were a terrible project of labor, and we're going to be talking more about this shortly, but they still wanted to make money, and it was going to take years to clear the rice fields. They had to move big stumps and fight alligators and water moccasins and all kinds of stuff in order to get the rice fields going. When you read the records in Charleston, you find out that in 1700 they were making money. They were making money from cattle products and pine products. This is where it came from. This place was the frontier of Charlestown, where we are right now is the frontier of Charlestown. And this is where those things were coming from. And they were harvesting the stuff of this area and moving it by river, the Ashley River primarily, down to Charlestown and shipping out of Charlestown to make money. One of the first families to get up in this area was the Axtells of Newington. The Axtells have a kind of a shady history in English history. Daniel Axtell, the guy we'll start with, was involved as an officer in the Parliament's army of the model army of Oliver Cromwell in the English Civil War, in which King Charles I was fighting for his throne and the principle of the divine right of kings against the Parliament of England, who were fundamentally toward what we call the Covenanters of Scotland. And the Covenanters were basically Protestant. King Charles was moving, he's married to a Catholic woman, and his religion was what we call today High Anglican at least. It possibly was even Catholic. But anyway, he didn't like the Parliament. The Parliament didn't like him. It turns out he lost, along with his crown, he lost what held his crown on his head. And that was put up on a stake, and they ran it around town for a while. The guy that did that was Daniel Axtell. Daniel Axtell was the colonel of the execution squad. And so he's a pretty popular guy for about 10 years, and then his popularity ended when Charles II came on the throne, the son of Charles I, or, yeah, grandson. Son. Grandson. Huh? Grandson. I think it's grandson of Charles I. Well, he thought Daniel Axtell was a bad idea and dispatched him pretty quickly. And parts of Daniel Axtell were found all over the kingdom. Daniel Axtell's son, named Daniel Axtell, there's some story about whether he became a friend of the king or whether the king just didn't want to have to put up with Axtells anymore. I'm not sure which way that went, but one way or the other, Daniel Axtell got land in this area, and the Axtell family got out of England. To get out of England, they came here, and Newington was probably one of the biggest and richest plantations in South Carolina in 1700. Newington was a huge place. It's south of Summerville, between here and the Ashley River, in the elbow of the Sawmill Branch. When you go down either Bacon's Ridge Road or Trolley Road, you're going on the perimeter of Newington. And Newington comes up into Summerville. The land of Newington comes up into Summerville. And the development at Newington was about rice fields and indigo. The Axtells were what they called separatists in those days, which meant they were not part of the Anglican movement that was supported by the king, and they were not neither were they part of the Puritan movement, which was opposing the Anglican Church in England, but was not exactly separate yet at the time they were going. The people who were Pilgrims were separatists. And the Pilgrims tended to be toward Calvinists. The reason all this religion stuff matters, but it mattered up here. All this stuff mattered in our history of who these people were. The Catholics in England had pretty well been suppressed after Charles I's death, and by 1700, Catholicism in England was not there. It was against the law for Catholics to be in positions of power in England. This had an effect on what happened in Charlestown because people were getting out of stuff. The same kind of fights, for instance, were going on with the Huguenots in France. The Huguenots were French Protestants who got run out of France in the 1690s and came to Charleston. That's where all the French names in Charleston come from. The Ravenels and the Legrees and all those people would be Huguenot people coming over here against religious persecution. So the Axtels were developing Newington. A road went through that area, from this area, that was described vaguely in the very few documents that we have about this area. But it went across, probably went across Newington Plantation to get to the Ashley River. Now, where were they going? Well, Lord Ashley's place was, as I said, across the Ashley River at the near Cook's Crossroads at the Heights up there, just east of Cook's Crossroads. On this side of the Ashley River, and a little bit south of that, another development was the colonial town of Dorchester. This today is what we call Dorchester's Park. Colonial Dorchester was settled around 1695 by Massachusetts Puritans. The Puritans had this notion of somehow improving the Episcopalians. They may still have this notion, but it doesn't happen. There's no point in it. That's just the way Episcopalians are. I'd say so, but they had this notion about it, and they were actually a missionary group that came down here. They came down as a congregation and set up at Colonial Dorchester on the banks there of the Ashley River by 1695 or so. And they became quite successful as a commercial center to receive the products that were coming out of this area to the river to ship it down to Charleston. They had quite a civilization there by 1720 or so. And they had established by 1724 what's called the Dorchester Free School. They didn't establish it. The Anglicans were part of the development too. If you've been to Colonial Dorchester, you've seen the ruins of the parish church. That's St. George's Parish Church. The original parish that we're in today for the Anglicans is St. George's. And that's where the St. George's Parish Church was in Dorchester. And so by 1720s, Anglicans and Puritans were in business together at Dorchester. The Anglicans set up the Free School, which you may have heard of. The Dorchester Free School was established as a movement that came out of England in the 1600s. It was based on Reformation principles of everybody needs to learn how to read so they can read the Bible. And the Bible was a primary textbook for the kids in the free school. The free school was designed for children who would not be able to afford a tutor, which is how most people, if they got educated, that's how they got educated, was go through a tutor. And so the wealthy people who were involved in all this stuff I'm talking about would make contributions to the education of indigent children. Now, the indigent children I'm speaking of were white children, but it was both girls and boys, which is a little unusual for that time, because most people thought that girls weren't worth educating. Now, that's not to say that they needed the education so much as that's what they said in those days. Girls are pretty smart. That's my experience. So the free school got started down there. It wasn't actually turning out students until around 1750. This matters because we're going to get into Summerville with the free school just about here. So we have the setup now for what was going on. Meanwhile, the people they were meeting in the woods were the local natives. In history, the people who lived around here were called Cusabo, C-U-S-A-B-O. Cusabo were in small tribal units all around this area. They primarily lived along the rivers. They didn't live in the pinelands, apparently. They lived along the rivers. And they had a waterborne culture of fishing and hunting along the riverbanks, as well as in the pinelands. They would come in the pinelands to get turkey and deer and buffalo, whatever they could find. When Lord Ashley's trading post set up, Cusabo began trading at the trading post deer skins and other products from the wildlife, woods. And deerskin became a very valuable commodity to ship out of Charleston. Meanwhile, the Kosovo had their problems with the Westo. The Westo were at Beach Hill. The Kosovo were primarily, probably of Creek origin. The Creek nation of American Indians were primarily around Alabama and Georgia. The pressure of colonization at New Orleans and at St. Louis and Detroit, just think about where the settlements were, mostly on rivers and coastlines, were pressing the American Indians inward into the inland areas. People were coming over here from the Mississippi area, and today they are represented by the Edisto Indians near Ridgeville. Those people, if you know about their name, is Natchez Cusso. And the Cusso part comes from the Kosovo part. The Natchez part comes from Natchez, which is where they came from. A lot of them came from, was from the Mississippi area. Moving eastward from the French settlements, running into the people around here. Okay, same thing's going up in Detroit and, I don't know, New York and places like that, Great Lakes area. The Iroquois and the Great Lakes nation were being pressed to come south. And one group that came south was the Westo. The Westo were probably Iroquoian, or at least related to Iroquoian in their origins. And they do this stuff by language primarily, trying to figure out where people came from. I'm talking about the Edmund Lundman, the Native Americans. And they think that it looks like the Iroquoian is the origins of the Westo. They settled over at Beach Hill, and that's where the name Westo over there comes from, is from their tribal origins. One really fascinating, we have it here on display in the museum, there's a little ball about this big. It's a little bit bigger than a golf ball. Somebody found it and said, what is it? I never saw one of those before. I didn't know what it was. It was basically very round. You can look at it. It was not a military slug like a canister ball or something like that, but it looked like it was made out of sandstone. Sandstone is basically the kind of rock around here. You don't see much other kind of rock except sandstone down here. And marl, which is seashell stone. But it was pecked, and pecked means until you make a ball out of it. And you can just look at it and see it. It's just pecked. And it's a ball. I didn't know what it was, and then I found out what it was. It's the core of a lacrosse ball. Now, where do they play lacrosse? They don't play it in Alabama, right? I never heard of lacrosse around here. The West of lacrosse. That's Great Lakes stuff. Just interesting. So the Westo didn't get along with anybody. They were looking for trouble. They were what historians would call warlike. And they got their fill of Kosovo down here really fast, and the Westo got wiped out by the Kosovo in American Indian Wars about the time of settlement was going on. The Kosovo got, and what happened to a lot of them is they got sold into slavery out of Lord Ashley's operation up here by the American Indians who had captured them. So that was part of the trading that was going on at the trading post, was the trading of American Indians into slavery. What do you think about that? That's wild. The American Indians, in their culture, didn't have much experience with work. They didn't wake up in the morning and go to a job. They woke up in the morning and found supper. And if they found supper, it was about supper time when they came home, and they would make supper. And then tomorrow they did it again. They had minor little gardens of maybe some corn and other maybe beans and things like that. We know that they probably grew things like that, but they fundamentally were what we call hunters and gatherers in history. That's what we call them, as a culture. And they did not make good slaves because they didn't get up and work. They went, yeah.
So, you said the Cusco sold the Westo?
The Westo.
The Westo.
Yeah, the Westo would sell them too if they caught them.
But was it mostly because they wanted to build a relationship with the European colonizers?
Well,
they were their enemies?
They were getting things at the American Indians were getting stuff they needed to live in the woods, like knives and hatchets and shovels and whatever implements and things like that. And they would be advantage of even weapons. It was to their advantage to trade if they had something to trade. And one thing they could trade up there because of slavery in the colonies by 1700, they could trade slaves. And so that's what they were doing. It's wild. So anyway, while this was going on, in the woodlands was developing lumbering and cattle raising. The cattle raising a little funny. How many of y'all have heard of cow pens? Cow pens is a battle in the Revolutionary War, but the word cow pens is not about a battle. The word cow pen is basically about a ranch of raising cows. The first guys up here were raising cows that were brought over primarily from Ireland, and they would bring them over in boats and slings, and they would just kind of nestle down in the bottom of the ship and just kind of walk along for a few weeks across the Atlantic Ocean, and then haul them out and drop them on the ground. They didn't know where they were, but where they were was here, and they brought them up here and raised them up here. The American Indians would run into them in the woods right here. They'd run into the woods and shoot them because they found out cows taste good. That's true. All right. So the planters who were trying to raise cattle up here got upset with American Indians. What are you doing shooting my cow? And the American Indians would say, why would you say it's your cow? I shot him. Because just like they didn't have a concept of work, they didn't have a concept of ownership. They owned what they had. That's all they knew. And you get what you have, and then you have it. That's how it works. And they didn't go much beyond that. And so they didn't really understand what the big deal was about shooting a critter in the woods. The guys that were doing the cowboying up here were called cattle hunters. Not cowboys, they were called cattle hunters, but they were the first American cowboys that were up here doing this in the woods. Just fascinating. So the guys doing lumber were primarily not cutting these great big trees down. I mean, my gosh, it'd take the rest of your life to cut down a tree 10 feet across. They were working with trees that had already been knocked down primarily, and they were using at the base of the trees is where the sap is. You may have noticed one time on an airplane that your ankles get swollen after a 6-hour flight. The same thing happens to pine trees. They get swollen down to the bottom from sap. And all you gotta do is tap into it. There it is. The sap comes out. And the sap had all kinds of value because in those days, everybody in Europe was mad at each other, just like all the American Indians here were mad at each other. And they were shooting down each other's ships. And shipping was a huge thing in colonial culture to bring stuff from colonies into the homelands in Europe. Ships were very, very important, and they were running out of wood in Europe. They literally, running out of trees in Europe. And they found this 100 miles of trees in America just waiting to be cut down. And so that became the project of getting the trees out of here for what they call naval stores. And that's what came out of Charleston, and that's how we know this place was active. We don't have a history of this stuff, I'm telling you, but that's where it came from. It came from here. This is where the naval stores stuff was. This was tar, caulking, and resins to preserve ropes and things like that, along with spars and masts and things like that out of the trees that were being produced here. The longleaf pine is a very strong tree, and it's makes very good lumber for building ships. So there you go. Now, the people now developing this stuff, the Embassy War happened in 1715, The Yamasee War was the major shooting war between the settlers and the American Indians. And it was, it involved this whole area. Newington was burned during the Yamasee War. The plantation house at Newington was burned during that time. Many people died in the Yamasee War. The settling population of Carolina diminished by 8% by the end of the war. They were dead. And it was all around this area of the back and forth of the war. It went on a couple of years. So all this feeds into who the people were that came here. We had the Presbyterian people came out of the Congregationalists of the Upper Ashley from Dorchester, were settling up the Ashley River, making plantations. And the English Anglicans were settling south of Charleston at Stono. These people began to learn that when they were up here doing work, they didn't get sick. And that 2 + 2 meant, well, maybe that's a good place to think about. Maybe we should get a second house. Now, I'm going to drop this part here now and let my friend Robert Scarlett talk. Robert is a teacher, and he and I work together on developing history. He's going to speak now about the part of African American history that feeds in with what I just told you.
Thank you, Doc. How you guys doing? Good. So, black man, white man, and Native American walk into a bar. It would be interesting though, right? Where's he going with that? But that's, when we're talking about those early people that he's mentioning, that's really the beginnings of Summerville. So I'm going to go a little different course. He told the nice stuff and needs to leave the nasty stuff for me. That's fine. That's fine. It's a young whippersnapper up there and get him to tell a little bit of history and anger some people. And I'm good at that, so that's okay. Ask my students. They'll tell you real fast. I'm a teacher at Fort Dorchester High School. So, yeah, go back to school in 2 weeks. Pray for me. 2 weeks. Yeah, July 31st. July 31st. I'm not complaining because they gave us an option last year. They put out a probable schedule for the next year where we could lose a week in the summer and gain a week's break during October. And so most of us picked gain the week during October because by that time we're ready to punch somebody. So it's like, yeah, give us a break. That's a great time to give us a break, so I'm not complaining. Huh? Did you say?
Gators.
Oh, Gators. Well, I ain't got nothing to do with that. I'm from Philly. Only Gators in Philly are on your feet. That's about it. So all this Southern stuff kind of throws me. I've been here since 2009, and I still ain't figured y'all out yet. So you remember, one thing that's good, history doesn't change. So let's look at that. So the era that I'm going to talk about, I like to refer to it as pre-Summerville. What was out there beforehand? Dr. West did a great job laying an amazing foundation. I'll sit out there saying, all right, I ain't got nothing else to say, thank you. Have a nice day. But I get to talk about those early people coming in, specifically, what is all this violent looking stuff behind me? What are you going to see on the screens of that violent stuff? Well, that's called the Stoner Rebellion. So you guys have probably at least heard of the Stoner Rebellion before, at least. All right, that's a good half of you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and how does that play into our story of what ends up being Summerville. So let's talk about the Stoner Rebellion. The Stoner Rebellion was the largest rebellion mounted by enslaved people in the history of colonial America. Nowhere else had a larger rebellion during colonial America. September 9th, 1739. Sunday, nice Sunday morning, like today. Started out with about 20 enslaved people gathered at a spot somewhere around the Stone River. So what you're looking at there is the ideas, one way to look at it is the red is where they gathered, the blue is where the militia said, yeah, you ain't going no further. It kind of gives you an idea of what we're dealing with, along as Dr. West was saying, like Highway 17 South there. So the march and the ensuing mayhem of the Stone Rebellion took place near the Stone River, less than 20 miles from what we think about as Charleston, along with today we look at as Highway 17 South. And their route intersected with, as you see that red line there, intersected with Highway 165, Delamar Highway, which leads up into Summerville. Fortunately for that area at the time, they kind of bypassed that and kept moving on. So what are some of the details of that uprising? Well, the details actually comes from one first-hand report and several second-hand reports. So what we look at here is the value of what we call oral history, getting stories from people, right? But one thing we've learned over the years is that oral history isn't always the most accurate, depending on who's saying it. So you always got to take that oral history from a grain of salt, but sometimes even from those who gives a so-called first-hand account. But we're gonna trust today's first-hand account person because they were a politician. We trust everything politicians. Okay, so I want you to think about this. Those different reports, the first one came from Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, right? So, politician, we can trust him. But those other reports came from a really diverse group of people. There was a ranger, a military man. One account came from an abolitionist perspective, so you know that's going to have a little tilt to it, right? From that abolitionist perspective. Another one came from a couple of businessmen that were inconvenienced by this revolution. You know, you can't have that. This is bad for business. And the last one I found really interesting. It was the only non-white person reporting on this, and this person claimed to be the great-great-grandson of the rebellion leader, right? The great-great-grandson part tells you you're a little far removed from what actually happened during that time. But it's interesting to try to learn these different experiences from different people. Sources differ on the origin of the people that led this rebellion, those first 20 rebels. Many say they came from the Kingdom of Congo. Others said they came from the nation of Angola. But all of them likely had military experience. Why is that? Well, one misperception that we often have that I actually have to get out of my students' head, like, no kids, white people did not go to Africa into the jungle, kidnap millions of black people, and drag them to America. It's not how it happened. Black people kidnapped black people and sold them to white people. That's a more accurate portrayal of what happened. And the reason why we look at these folks as having military experience, because the majority of the enslaved came about in war. Two kingdoms would fight. The prisoners of war would be sold to the Europeans. That's how the vast majority of the 12.5 million Africans pulled out of the continent into slavery around the world actually occurred. And despite what we think about in America, we think slavery, United States, bad people, right? That's what we think about when we think about slavery. Well, guess what, folks? The United States got 4% of the slaves. 4%. So that means 96% of those 12.5 million others were other places around the world. With number one, by far, 40% of them went to Brazil. Yeah, that's yes, the majority of them were spread all around the world. We are actually kind of the last into the slavery game. Not that that's a good thing, but it's not really an American phenomenon like a lot of people kind of paint it to be. So according to the most consistent accounts, the group's first stop was a place called Hutchison's Store near Wallace Creek, down near the Stone River. And when you hear Hutchison, yes, same family as Hutchison's Square. Same family, right? So they were not the ones killed. The storekeepers, they murdered the two storekeepers, cut their heads off, put their heads on the front steps of the store, stole guns, ammunition, grabbed a fifth of vodka or so, alcohol. That comes into play a little bit later for them, in a bad way. And they just marched off. So obviously they were feeling rather emboldened. They obviously wasn't doing this in secret when you put their heads on the front steps. Somebody might notice that, right? So they, for whatever reason, they weren't too worried about that. So they were near what's called, if you're familiar with St. Paul's Parish, down in that area, where they killed those people and stole the ammunition. But then we talk about what comes next. what's the plan? You done killed some folks. What is your plan? They marched down the main road, when we talk about Highway 17A, marched down the main road carrying a big old banner that read Liberty and beating on drums and blowing on horns. Why'd they do that?
They're soldiers.
They're soldiers, that's one thing. But why do you think they did that? What were they doing? Trying to build up their army, trying to recruit, right? They try, as they're passing by these plantations, they want to know. They want people to know, hey, here we are, come join us. And by the time it was all over, there was between, depending on which account you look at, between 60 and 100 in their army from that original 20 that started out. So we believe the plan, which makes perfect sense, the plan was for them to escape to Spanish Florida. At that time, Spain was owned by Florida. Florida was owned by Spain. There we go. Get that order right. So Spanish Florida would welcome them in. They actually set up the first, what we think about as maroon communities, and we'll talk more about the Maroons in a little bit, at a place that they designated as Fort Mosaic. So if you can escape from the British, because we hate the British, that's the Spanish, not us. The Spanish, we hate the British, and so you escape from the British, you'll be free here. One condition, you gotta become a Catholic and join our army, fight against the British. Now your wife and kids, they can settle in Fort Mosaic, but we got work for you to do. So they headed for good reasons to that area. Their tactics were very simple. They surrounded plantations, killed all the white people. Real simple. I mean, all the way down, sadly, to the children. We're not leaving anybody behind. And try to coerce those enslaved people there to come join them and keep on heading off to Florida. You want to be free? Come with us. So unfortunately for the marchers, around 11 a.m., they were accidentally discovered by Lieutenant Governor of the colony, a man by the name of William Bull. He was coming back with 4 other people, and he happened to notice this rebel force. And fortunately for him, they escaped to sound the alarm. And he became the only eyewitness account for this particular event. Bull says that by the time they discovered the rebels, they had already killed 21 whites and were headed towards Georgia. Lieutenant Governor provided the only witness account. Him and the rebels, him and the men that were with him, immediately went into town. But Bull himself, in his account, blamed the Spanish. I kind of gave you an idea of why. But more specifically, in his written statement, he said that the King of Spain's order at St. Augustine, declaring freedom to all Negroes who should desert from the British colonies, was the reason for this particular uprising. So why not blame the British? I guess it's a nice one. Okay, so after traveling more than about 10 miles, the group of roughly about 60 to 100 rebels, they rested. They stopped, cracked open a cold one. They grabbed from Hutchinson Square. Or not Hutchinson Square, but Hutchinson Store. Reason why we say that is that almost every account says that when they ran across the rebels, they were very drunk and partying. They were having a good old time out in the woods. So they probably thought, it's a bunch of us now, we got this far, nobody gonna mess with us. Let's get our drink on. And then we'll head on back a little later. That didn't work out too well for them. They stopped in a field forever known as the battlefield. That was that, where you see the blue star on that map. The battlefield, still in South Carolina. And then, of course, the rebels had to face against Lieutenant Governor Bull and his people. So let me slow down. Let me get back to that main part. All right, so Stolen Rebellion increased already strong fears held by slave owners and other whites in the area. Rebellion led to a temporary decline in importation of Africans. Don't bring no more of them in here. They cause trouble. But you know, money is always going to outrule common sense. Right? That's going to be a problem. But the reason why they did that, because the South Carolina area was already known as Negro country. Blacks outnumbered whites. because they were enslaved, population. They outnumbered whites, so they had a real good reason to go, one day these brothers are going to learn how to count. They're going to realize there's a whole lot more of them than there is of us. You want a very interesting tale where that really came into play, look at the Haitian Revolution of 1791. That's when that really, really came into play. 500,000 blacks realized there was 40,000 whites. Didn't have the advantage, and that's when Haiti was born as the first black republic. Short version of the Haitian Revolution. So the fear led to South Carolina assembling a 7-person committee. I think I've gone a little too far. Let me see. Yeah. I don't want to miss the fight. I don't want to miss the fight. The fighting's always interesting. All right, there we go. So around 4 p.m., Lieutenant Governor Bull's men and militia, about 100 of them, most of them were dragged out of church service in the Presbyterian church. Because at that time, there was a law in the province where all white men's got to take their guns to church. Because they knew they were outnumbered. So they said, we got to be prepared for anything. So they were ready. So they literally just pulled them out of church service and said, let's go. We got some rebels to fight. And that's how that actually happened. So when the rebels were attacked, many of them scattered. Some of them probably didn't know which way they were going. They were drunk anyway. Some of them. But many of them, about 30 of them, stayed in fort. And among those was considered the rebel leader stayed in fort. And that rebel leader has many different names in history. The most prominent name is Jimmy. That's the name that they say he had. Another was Cato. And a third, which is really far out there, if you read the book, an interesting book called Stone Up. Name was Arnold. Arnold. Know where that one came from. That's the only one story in the book that Clyde claims is Arnold. You read his whole story like, yeah, I think he's making this up as he goes along. The thing about reading historical text, you never know what was going through their mind for real. So according to one Negro man, this is why he said it, about 50 of these villains attempted to go home. So they wanted to pretend like, hopefully I wasn't missed. I can just slip back in, right? Tell the wife, oh, slide back into bed. What, something happened? I was here all along. Yeah, it didn't really work out too well. And so those folks, many of them were caught, and they had their heads chopped off. And they would post their heads on a pike at every mile marker. Why would they do that?
Show you what happens.
Exactly. Exactly. See, y'all want to try this? You don't want to be the next one. This is what happens to those that rebel. So I'm sure that was an interesting commute down that highway for a while, as long as that lasted. Had the guts to take them down. But several planters actually released their slave, forgave them if they believed that they were coerced into it. I know you didn't really want to do this. So, get back to it. Now, I think there's probably a financial component to that. If I chopped your head off, you can't pick the cotton. You know? So I'm sure there was that component as well. So despite how this tale is usually told, this was not a one-day affair. A second battle happened the following Sunday against a large group. As a result, the planters often lived in fear. Another historic document states, and I'm going to quote, the parson to St. Paul Parish suggested small bands of Stonewall rebels roamed the vicinity for months after the revolt and kept whites on edge. Most accounts suggest that 21 whites were killed and 44 of the enslaved Africans were killed. Stonewall Rebellion increased strong fears already, because as I said before, it was a very, very dark community. There were more blacks than there were whites, so that was a reason to have a lot of fear. So the fear led to assembling a 7-person committee to recommend strengthening the 1737 Patrol Act, which passed in 1740, and a thorough overhaul of the South Carolina Slave Code, resulting in something with a title that I always find interesting to read. A bill for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in this province. Interesting title. I always wonder who were the other slaves. Yeah, there were Native American slaves, right? If you were dark, you were slave. So it wasn't just the Negro population. But it's interesting that this new act not only pertained to the blacks, but it also regulated the behavior of whites. The reason was they said, well, if we can force you to be less brutal to the enslaved population, maybe they'll have no reason to rebel or to run away. So I'm going to give you just a taste of some of the new rules that were put in place for each group. So we'll start with the whites first. Owners must pay £5 if they work a slave on Sunday, except for house servants. I get my own breakfast. Come on. Let's be real about it. I'm not doing all that. I'm making my own pie. You know what I'm saying? No. Slaves cannot be denied sufficient clothing or food. It became illegal to work slaves over a certain number of hours. Okay. They had a union. Plantations could not allow slaves to leave town or the plantation without written permission. And it was illegal to teach a slave to write or to use them as a scribe, which they used to do before. They would teach them to read and write so they could work as their secretaries and accountants and so forth. That became illegal. Of course, the greatest impact would be felt by the enslaved. They could no longer sell goods. Many of them on Sundays, which was the usual day off, they would go out, sell goods to make money. Many of them have bought their way to freedom through that. Others would use that money to buy food because their meager allowance of food was not very much. So if they can buy some food to supplement that meager allowance, they would do so. They could not carry guns. Gotta give them that. I understand. I ain't mad at you. They could not assemble. This was done to prevent planning rebellions. The enslaved would be put to death for killing a white person or attempting to raise a rebellion. The enslaved could not hit a white person. And the third offense of this will result in death. The enslaved could not own property of any kind. They couldn't own a boat, a mule, a house, anything. They used to have their own little stores and stalls and horses and stuff to take their stuff to market on Sundays and so forth. They could no longer own anything. And last, and it's not last, it's a whole list, but last I'm going to share with you, no men slaves exceeding 7 in number shall hereafter be permitted to travel together without some white person with them. Even their church services had to be supervised by white men in order for them to gather on Sundays. It's also incentivized the capture of runaways. So here's 2 examples of that. Any person capturing a runaway attempting to make his way to Spanish Florida will be rewarded. They even pay for every scalp of a captured runaway on one condition. The scalp had to still have the ears attached. Yeah, that would have been a nasty one. Since Georgia was not yet a slave colony, escaping across Savannah River may be viewed by some as escaping to freedom, although Georgia had a good deal with South Carolina to recapture slaves. They were not exactly friends of yes.
So at this point in history, was the territory of Georgia, was it the full state that it is now? I know in the original 13, it was
well, none of them were the same territory. The lines changed. But more importantly, during that time, when Lord Oglethorpe became the leader of Georgia, Georgia was originally founded as a penal colony, basically, a debtor's colony. It was founded for those poor folk to be able to work off their debts. Nobody was allowed to make a profit in the original colony of Georgia until the king took it over and made it a royal colony. Now make me some money, bring some slaves in, do all that kind of stuff. So, but at this point, Georgia was not yet a royal colony, so we didn't have slavery at that time. Great question. And the courts would accept the testimony from Indians, mulattoes, or mestizos against free Negroes. That's the only ones they could testify against. Mulattoes, of course, being biracial, mixture of black and white, basically, and mestizos being what we today call Mexicans. The original title for that was the mixture of the Spanish and the indigenous from that area. They were known as mestizos. That's where the original term comes from. So a letter written between 2 business partners sum up the impact of this one rebellion on the white population when it says, and I quote, "Plainly this was a worrying time for white South Carolinians. especially those with a political and economic stake in what was among British North America's most affluent and flourishing colony. Translation, investment for money. Knock it off. One account stated that fearful whites moved out of Stono and into town. And that can account for some of those descendants of whites living in Summerville later on. So we'll get a little bit more into that. All right, here comes a little repeat stuff, because Dr. West went deep into my life. Still love you. So the occupation of many of these early laborers help us understand the occupations of the earliest inhabitants. One quote says, 5 Negroes who were cattle hunters at Indian land made their escape. My focus here is not on the escape. My focus here is on the concept of a cattle hunter. So in case you didn't get it from Doc, I'm going to give it to you again. As we know, Summerville was carved from the pines. How'd that happen? Who did it? What role did non-whites play in the development of this land? Those are the folks we often forget about when we talk about the origin of a land. Somebody set it up. Somebody made it possible to live there. And so we'll talk about some of those folks. Cattle hunters can help answer this question. Many enslaved Africans were brought from regions in West Africa, which established traditions of cattle herding and managing the cattle. They adapted these skills to their new environment. They became the primary managers of cattle, often on horseback, which is odd because slaves were not allowed to ever ride a horse. But those early colonies depended on them as those early ones managing the horses. They were skilled in using fire to clear land and create grazing areas for the herds. So as Dr. West was talking about, a lot of the area preparation was done by those groups. In colonial times, the term cattle hunter referred to individuals responsible for managing and rounding up the cattle. Why did they call them cattle hunters? They were called cattle hunters because they didn't have fenced-in areas back then. The cattle were just released. Yeah, they were free-range cattle. You don't hear that term today. Think about chickens, right? Free-range chickens. Well, they were free-range cattle. One of the meat was any better. So they would have to literally go out and hunt for them. They got to go find them to bring them in, right? So they consider that cattle hunting. And those wide open areas, some refer to them as cow pens. Doc kind of talked about that. So you have two different ways of looking at cow pens. Those big open pasture areas, but also a modern word like ranch might be used to describe a cow pen, right? Areas where they actually worked with the cattle. So these enslaved Africans, and let me add, indentured servants, were also integral to the beginning of Summerville. If you don't know what indentured servant is, I call them white slaves. I call them white slaves. Because basically, it's like, look, I'm going to sign myself into slavery for a 5 to 7 year period. I'm broke, I ain't got nowhere to live, I need a job. I'm yours for this contract period. You know? It's kind of like 30 years I spent in the military. Every few years, I had to sign a new contract that said, send me where the heck you want. Right? Until you end up in Iraq, it's like, maybe I should have thought about this. Yeah, maybe I should have thought about this. Spent some time in the Philippines too, though, so we got something in common here. I actually like the Philippines. Okay, so yeah, that was the idea of those early cattle hunters. So these enslaved Africans and indentured servants would interact with an even more historic traveler, as Doc mentioned, the American Indian. These workers would trade with local tribes who used the pre-Summerville area as a major hunting ground. But I did learn about the fire part. I didn't know that. That's kind of cool. You flush them out. I like that. Make it work a little bit easier. They mainly hunted for wild turkey and deer, which they would trade with cattle hunters in the area. So that adds to another group that actually started before the Stone Rebellion. They've been around for a while, but their story is very interesting. This is a very short part, so don't fear. I'm not going off on a long tangent somewhere else. So during and after the Stone Rebellion, another group of African Americans made their mark, and they are known as the Maroons. Maroons. Now, not only South Carolina, really came from Jamaica and Africa, especially up in the North Carolina, Virginia area, they were heavy. But we'll talk about the Maroons of South Carolina. Start with a basic definition. What is Maroons? Or who were the Maroons of South Carolina? Maroons is defined as the act of running away to form a Maroon community. So these were folks that said, all right, I'm in South Carolina. I've heard of these free places like Philadelphia, Ohio. I don't know where that is, and I heard it's really, really far. So instead of trying to escape all the way there, I'm just gonna hide in the woods and the swamps. And they developed communities out in the swamps. I mean, real communities. Some of them were out there for dozens of years. The largest maroon community is not really in South Carolina, existed for 100 years. But the ones around here would have been probably a lot smaller communities. So they were just folks that decided we're just gonna hide in the woods and never come out, except when we need to. So as mentioned with the Stone Rebellion, Spanish authorities in Florida offered freedom. So a lot of folks decided to try to go that way. But Maroons survived by trading with nearby Indians, as Doc was talking about. Trading with Indians. Slave laborers and white settlers, they traded with them as well, for guns and ammunition and tools. If necessary, they raided plantations and took what they needed. Understand? So Maroons, indentured servants, slave laborers, Native Americans, they all developed this important trade relationship that were both defensible and, or shall I say, the Indians helped them to find places that were defensible and had a ready supply of fresh water. So they worked together quite often to survive. So in the swamps, these fugitives lived in relative security and plenty. They built cabins, planted corn, raised hogs and fowl, which they stole from their neighbors. And naturally, the hunting out there was free. We know there was a large Maroon community at Beach Hill at the time of the Stone Rebellion. I think Doc talked a little bit about Beach Hill, and I'll mention that a little bit more. As you heard, African Americans have been part of Summerville history from the earliest time. They were here before the first permanent homes were built around 1800. And the book Stono talks about how some of the enslaved served as cattle hunters, which we had mentioned before. This included enslaved and indentured servants, controlling cattle, but also lumbering was very important, which Doc also mentioned. Lumbering has always been a thriving business in Summerville. From these early settlers of the Pine Village making naval stores to several sawmills producing lumber. These early men and women often interacted with local Native American tribes, hunting in the forest. So I'm not going to go over Lord Ashley's trading post because he went over that pretty thorough. And I guess I'm going to sing this part anyway. I like it. Good, thank you. So connection between the Westo and Cusabo Creek tribes was not always friendly, as he mentioned, toward enslaved Africans or toward each other. In fact, the Westo were in a state of war with the local Cusabo in the first few decades of European encroachment. Tribal people were exchanging enemy Native American POWs as slaves at Lord Ashley's post. It's just like the Africans were doing, trading their POWs to the Europeans, forcing them into slavery. Thousands of Native Americans were forced into slavery by the time of the Stone Rebellion, mostly for service in Barbados. That's where they were shipped into. Early history of enslaving Indians was not very successful because they knew the land. It was easy for them to escape and get back to their tribe or another tribe that would take them in. So in order to hold on to them, ship them off to Barbados. And if you don't know, South Carolina itself was settled by plantations in Barbados. So when the Lord proprietors came here, many of them came from Barbados and established plantations here. That's how South Carolina got, or the Carolinas, I keep saying South Carolina, how the Carolinas themselves got started. So when rice planters began building summer homes near the bluffs of the Sawmill Branch, slave Africans, indentured servants, they were the servants as part of the community. Records of these earliest servants are very rare because once again, they were not allowed to learn how to read or to write. So that brings us back up to the establishment of Summerville proper as a town and back to the Great Dome.
Great job.
Can I ask you one?
Yes.
Were there any free blacks in this area?
Yes, there were.
In the 1830s?
And I don't know about this area specifically.
I know about Charleston, but I was
Yeah,
wondering
I don't know about the Summerville area specifically, but whenever I hear people talk about free blacks during that time, it kind of saddens me a little because they were also some senior slave owners. It was free blacks, bought slaves too, to work their fields. Yes?
So I know, so you explained what, like, who the Maroons are, but how did they simply name them? So I hear
Oh,
when I get those.
the name Maroons come from the Spanish word Cimarron, which means wild and untamed. So these folks, and I don't have my usual maroon, I don't have my maroon picture up there, but these folks were, you know, prehistoric, almost out in the woods and just barely a piece of leather to cover the stuff that God gave them. And so they were considered the wild, untamed people of the forest. So Cimarron means wild and untamed. So that's where the word comes from.
And is that why slavers never attempted to try and, I guess, capture that?
Oh, they did. Oh, they did. Well, you got to come to my Maroons next. They did. And matter of fact, the whites were like, we ain't going out there. Because they were deep in there with the alligators and the moccasins and all that kind of stuff. And if you ever, anybody been to Cypress Gardens? And all the knees around those trees, can't get a horse through there. So if I can't take my horse and I can't drag my cannon, I ain't going. So the way they captured the Maroons was hire the Indians. They would hire the Indians to go up there and get them. And that's what a lot of the captures that did happen. So they wanted them, but they wasn't setting themselves up in there. So the success that they did have was done by the American Indians. Any other questions on the Stone Rebellion? All right, Doc.
I want y'all to know you signed up till 3:30 today.
Thank you.
So we've kind of caught you up to maybe 1725 or so of what was going on around here. Getting now into the actual movement of people into this area to settle. The Congregationalists at Fort Dorchester, Colonial Dorchester, left that area around 1751, moving down to Liberty County, Georgia, because they were getting trouble with malaria where they were living along the Ashley River. It was a very thriving community of trade, and then all of a sudden it was just abandoned. The influence of these people was left behind because a number of them had old plantations by now up the Ashley River. These are now Presbyterians, or Calvinists, they would have been called in 1700, early 1700s, but they became what are called Presbyterians after a while. And they were doing places like large plantations up toward Ponds and Summers Corner, and then all of this inland area here. The planters from Stono and the planters along the Upper Ashley began to understand if they came into the woods around the Sawmill Branch before the second week of May and didn't leave until the first frost, that they didn't get country fever, malaria. They thought it was the pine trees. And the theory about the pine trees began to develop at that point about what was it about the pine trees that makes you healthy. And by the Civil War, which is 100 years later, they had a wonderful, wonderful fantasy about how the pine trees keep you healthy. That would be another subject probably to go into. But anyway, they were convinced that the pine trees kept them healthy. And so they started coming up here in this area around 1800, perhaps a little bit earlier. We don't have any record of any of this. We're guessing this is what happened. We know that they were here probably building shelters at least by 1800. The way they saw what they were doing here was it was a summer refuge. And so the Maroon people who were already here were here for the same reason they were here. They're trying to get away. They called, the planters who came here, called what they were doing going on a maroon. And that's where I first ran into the word maroon. They called it going on a maroon in their writing. They were going to go on a maroon up to Summerville. They started calling this place Summerville because it's where they came in the summertime. But this is very few of them now. I'm not talking, it's probably not more than 10 to 20 families. But when they would come here, they would come, it would be a big deal. And they would talk about it in the winter about what you're doing this summer to go on the They would load up wagons pulled by oxen commonly from all these plantations. If you can imagine the difficulty of a 20-25 mile radius around this area, to the south, basically, from plantations, the roads were awful. Dorchester Road was almost nothing. Into the time of the Civil War, Dorchester Road was almost nothing. Now it's still almost nothing, but it's got a lot of traffic on it. But the Ashley River Road was the primary way that it came. And up from Stono on the Delmar Highway. And it's one thing to say, you know, you on asphalt coming up Highway 17 up to Cook's Crossroads to Bacon's Bridge to come into Summerville. But if you think of how much lowland is in that area, and trying to get a wagon through that with oxen pulling it, that must have been a mess. It just must have been a mess. But it was a big deal, and they did it every summer, or every spring, I should say, late spring. And they would get up here by the first week of May or so, and they would live in temporary shelters to start with, and then they started building homes. And some of the first homes they built were around the area that became property of the pastor of the St. Paul's Parish of Stono. St. Paul's Parish today is Stono. The pastor of the St. Paul's Parish was Philip Gadsden. He's an Anglican pastor. He bought a lot of property right over here, about a mile from here. And he started attending to his flock that were up here from Stono, and finally moved up here. He bought property up here, would come up here in the summertime because that's where his people were. And they had what they called a chapel of ease, which would be an intermediate parish meeting place. It was not the actual parish church, but it would be a place that was more convenient for a group of people that were more isolated, and that's where they would meet on Sunday. And he would come up here to Summerville and have services in Summerville. The primary place they had services usually was in someone's home. The homes were going up by 1810 to 1820, pretty clearly they were going up by that time. And some of the oldest homes in Summerville today, over in what's called the old part of town, around St. Paul's Church, are dated from that time. They mostly built along what we call West Carolina Avenue in the St. Paul's area, Linwood and Sumter. That's where most of them were. But I'm talking about they were perhaps a mile or more from each other. They weren't building a village. They were living in the woods. And they've oriented their houses all kinds of ways. You can go on Sumter Avenue today and look at the back porches of people who live on Sumter Avenue, because the road was on the other side of the house when they built the house. And they were putting up dams over on Marion, what we call Marion Avenue today. Marion Avenue was not part of the original settlement. It was outside of the settlement on Marion, what they called Summerville. And some of the oldest houses in Summerville were outside of it, because they weren't thinking of building a village. What's called the Lynch House at 5 Points is one of the earliest ones. It was not part of Summerville, of the village. The Cuthbert House on Marion is still one of the oldest houses in Summerville, still standing. It's a wonderful, very early Southern country house. It's being restored right now. And it is also outside of what they call Summerville. Briarwood Lane was part of what they were doing. They thought Briarwood Lane, which is going over toward all the construction on Richardson Avenue. It's an extension just west of St. Paul's Church going north, basically. And Briarwood Lane would have been part of what they were doing. They had a little bit of building on what we call Hickory Hill, which is basically the hill that Richardson Avenue runs up on top of from the town. The Boyles Run we're on Hickory Hill at a place called the Hickory. It's very early. They were building a little bit along what's called Dorchester Avenue today in that area. And that's Philip Gaston owned that land right there at Dorchester and modern Central Avenue. He owned that land. And he owned another land with the glebe, I guess, of St. Paul's Church. He owned all that. He owned a lot of land. By 1820, they were meeting probably at the postern. I'm talking about the Anglican planters were meeting at the postern. The postern was on Briarwood Lane. The word postern means back porch. And it was named that because it was the back porch of Summerville. Out on Briarwood Lane, the back porch of Summerville. By that time, this is in 1810 to 1820, they had built two buildings that were semi-public. One of them was called the lecture room. The lecture room was a meeting hall, basically. It was on on Central Avenue as you go past Somerville Baptist Church and Carolina and Central, go west on Central. If you think about it, you go up a hill and around a curve, and you're going now by Dorchester Avenue. That's where Gadsden's property was. Just on the corner on the east side of that is what's called the Manigault House. The Manigault House was not there then. That was not property for Manigault at that time. They were building. But right beside the Manigault House, if you're ever driving up Central Avenue, look to your right, you go past 3 or 4 houses, and then there's woods, and then there's the Manigault House. The woods is where the lecture room was. The woods is also where the Presbyterian Church was built in 1830, because the Presbyterians were here, and the Presbyterians had a manse across the street from St. Paul's Church, but didn't have a church. Episcopalians had a church by that time, but didn't have a manse. The guy we get most of our information from is John Gaston. John Gaston was the son of Philip Gaston, the pastor of St. Paul's. John Gaston was an educator, and we can go into him in detail sometime. But John Gaston was born in the Presbyterian manse, and his father's Episcopal minister, Anglican minister. And he was born in the Presbyterian manse across the street from St. Paul's Church. That's where he came from. I guess they were living there. I really don't know. I mean, Mom was there for some reason, besides delivering babies. I don't think it was maternity ward. So I don't know how that worked. At the lecture room is where the free school met. The free school had moved up here when the colonials at Dorchester left in 1750. The free school operated wherever. I think they probably still met at Dorchester for a while. I really don't know. They had a permanent structure there at Dorchester, a substantial building at Dorchester. But by 1820 to 1830, they were meeting at the lecture room in Summerville, and the guy who was running the free school, a guy named Daniel Whitaker, just found this stuff out recently. This is how we're doing work down here. We're just tracking all these people down, seeing if we can figure out who they are. Daniel Whitaker turned out to be a very literate guy who actually was publishing a literary magazine in the 1840s. But he was here in Summerville between 1825 probably and 35, somewhere in that range, running the school. We know that he was working in magazines with Edgar Allan Poe. You probably heard of him. And we're still trying to find what Poe said about Daniel Whitaker. I'm pretty sure there's an essay by Poe about Whitaker that's going to give us a lot more information. We're trying to find this stuff. Another guy who lived here early was William Gilmore Sims. How many of y'all were educated in South Carolina schools before 1985? There you go. And I just talked to Summers Corner last week, and I said, how many of you, and nobody was from South Carolina. So I know I'm talking to some local boys in here today, and I'm glad to meet you, I'm glad you're here, because we need to know this stuff, as Summervillians, we need to know this stuff about ourselves. So, William Gilmore Simms wrote a South Carolina history in 1860. He lived in Summerville in the 1830s, somewhere around 1835 to 1845 or something like that. His house burned down, and I think that's why he moved, as far as I can tell. And he's considered more of a Charlestonian or a Walter Burr, Colleton County guy. His granddaughter republished his histories in about I think her first edition was in 1916 or so, of Oliphant's Simms' history. Her name was Oliphant. She was his granddaughter, and she edited it over and over. And if you were in South Carolina schools up to 1985, that was the history you were using. And the guy lived here. Isn't that interesting? Who would have thought that? Okay. I'm telling you this because the people that came here are really quite a group. There were probably 4 or 5 doctors here in 1820. One of them was the widow of the doctor who married Whitaker. I don't know whether he lived here or not, but I do know he married out at Dorchester, Acona, Dorchester. And I know that he came from a plantation near here. I don't know where he came from around here. His name was Stubbins Firth. That's Firth with 2 F's. I have no idea what kind of a mother would name her child Stubbins, but that was what his first name was. He was Scott, and probably didn't mind being named Stubbins if he was Scott, but I really don't know. So Stubbins first studied with Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia. You ever heard of him? Benjamin Rush was a big deal Revolutionary War doctor who was famous. Well, first of all, he's considered the father of modern psychiatry, but also he was famous for his work in yellow fever. Yellow fever was a huge problem. Yellow fever was a big problem in Charleston. It was not a problem in the countryside around Summerville. No one around here got yellow fever here. People came here with yellow fever and died here with yellow fever, but they didn't get it here. And they knew this in the 1700s. They knew you didn't get yellow fever in Summerville. You didn't get malaria in Summerville, you didn't get yellow fever in Summerville. Stubbins Firth tried to get malaria. If you look online, you can look him up online, America's 10 most famous mad scientists. It's a local boy. Stubbins had a patient who died of yellow fever, trying to find out whether yellow fever was contagious or not. And the way he tried to find it out was he got some specimens from his former patient and gave it to his dog in a bowl as a sop. Puts it, bread, made it, soaked it up, put it in a dish, and the dog knocked it off. He liked it. So Stubbins gave it to him straight, and he lapped it up, and he did fine with it. So Stubbins shot him up with it, and he's still fine. So Stubbins started doing it to himself, including injecting himself. He didn't get yellow fever. Stubbins concluded, he studied under Benjamin Rush now. He did all the stuff that Rush was doing in Philadelphia, came down here and did some more. Stubbins concluded that yellow fever was not contagious. Set science back 100 years. But this was knowledge that came out of Summerville, medical knowledge that came out of Summerville about yellow fever. They did know if you came to yellow fever, you didn't get it. I mean, you came to Summerville, you didn't get yellow fever here. They knew that. So these are 2 typical guys. Another one was Daniel Flood. Daniel Flood was a doctor who was here early, and he had quite a history after this, into the Civil War and beyond the Civil War. Dr. DuPont was here, Dr. Gideon DuPont is listed on the South Carolina Patriot Assembly meeting at Jacksonboro in 1781, has Dr. DuPont as a loyalist. That was a bad idea to be on that list. This list was published in Charlestown by the British, who the people were declared loyalists by the South Carolina Patriot Assembly at Jacksonboro. And Dr. DuPont's on the list. Now, this puts him in an odd place. The loyalists coming out of the Revolutionary War had a really hard time in South Carolina because the Revolutionary War in South Carolina was basically a civil war. Most of the planters in the Low Country were patriots, but a whole lot of the upcountry was not. A whole lot of the upcountry was like loyalists, and it was actually about a third were patriots, about a third were loyalists, and about a third just didn't want to get involved with it and didn't want to get shot, and so they were kind of floating with whatever was going on best. Well, anyway, he was considered a loyalist because of certain things that he did that showed his colors. He may have come here because of that, I don't know, because he lost a lot. He was a big deal in here in South Carolina before the Revolution, but he actually lived in Summerville after the Revolution. And the repatriation of loyalists was a big deal in 1785 to 1800, because a whole lot of them left the state. I mean, just left. And so places were abandoned and things like that when they were getting out of here. But and these are typical people that were coming up here. Others are names that you can see them on the streets around here, of famous people, families that were here. Children started being born here, probably around 1825 or so. John Gadsden was a child who was born in the village at the Presbyterian rectory in 1833. And he gives us a list of the children who were born here that he knew, who grew up with him. And so this gives us a whole list of people that we know these families were here, and these are the children of these families, so we have names that way. We're trying to track all these people down one way or the other. It's very interesting work, and the story goes on and on about it. You go into individual stories and get all kinds of things out of it. I want to end, though, by telling you about something that happened by 1830. There were probably 25 to 30 families living here, spaced out throughout the area around St. Paul's Church. If there were roads, they were built by cows and goats. And they just kind of wove in and out of the pine trees to get to where they were trying to go. They all knew each other. Many of them were intermarried. The families were intermarried, and they were all related to each other and that sort of thing.